This is the devotional for Thursday, October the 14th. The title of the devotional is the Judas Iscariot Psalm, the Treachery of a Friend. Now, the scripture reading is Psalm 109 and Psalm 110. They are both written by David. Our focus, though, for this devotional is going to be Psalm 109, identified by some as the Iscariot Psalm, noting that there is much of the psalm that gives us a prophetic picture of Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus Christ, the Messiah King. Now, our devotional then is Psalm 109. Now, Psalm 109 gives us an agonizing testimony of a king who had known the sorrow and disappointments of betrayals. Like Christ, who suffered the betrayal of Judas and the denials of Peter, David suffered many disloyalties in his lifetime. King Saul, provoked by jealousy, turned against David and would have killed him. Absalom led an insurrection against his father, and Ahithophel, one of David's trusted advisors, betrayed him and cast in his lot with his son. Shimei, a Benjamite, cursed David and hurled stones and accusations against the king as he fled his palace in Jerusalem. If you would, allow me to suggest a brief outline of Psalm 109. Now, the first point would be verses 1 through 5, and I've subtitled a prayer for deliverance from enemies. Now, the psalm begins with David appealing to the Lord, saying, "Hold not thy peace," literally saying to the Lord, "Don't be silent." And then David describes the sins of his enemies in verse 2 and 3, slander and lies and deceit and unprovoked hatred. And what was David's response to the injustices he suffered? Verse 4, he prayed. And then he protested the cruelty of his enemies to the Lord, saying in verse 5, "They have rewarded me evil for good and hatred for my love." Now, verse 6 and through 20, I've given another point title, A Prayer of Judgment Against One's Enemies. Now, this is an incredible prayer, and some with a sensitivity that might not be rooted in righteousness might wonder, why would the king or a believer pray such a prayer of judgment against his enemies? Well, let's look at it for a few moments, beginning in verse 6 and going all the way through verse 20. Now, David, in verse 6 and 7, professed his virtue, his rightness before God, and then he appealed to the Lord to judge his enemies for their injustices in the manner of an imprecatory prayer, a prayer calling for God's judgment. David prayed in verse 6 and 7, "Let the wicked be judged by their own," that is, by others of their own ilk, their own wickedness. Let his days, verse 8, be few, and then let another take his office, take his place. And then we're reminded, remembering a prophetic aspect of Psalm 109, that after Judas betrayed Jesus, he went out and he hanged himself, Matthew 27 and verse 5, and he fulfilled this prophecy that David was writing about in Psalm 109. In fact, of Judas, his days were few. And in Acts chapter 1, a believer named Matthias took his place. Now, verses 8 through 20, again, the focus is upon calling for God's justice, for fairness, for David as he professes his rightness before God and the injustices he had suffered. Now, verse 8 and 9, the children and the household of the wicked fall under the shadow of God's judgment. David prayed, "Let the children of the wicked be fatherless." That is, let their line be cut off. Let their estate fall victim to extortioners, to those who would take all that they own and not leave it for their sons and daughters, and the lineage be cut off. Verses 14 and 15, "May the children of the wicked bear the curse and judgment of their father's sins." Now, what manner of men are the wicked? Well, they, in verse 16 and 17, are described as the men that lack compassion for the needy, and they curse the innocent. The wicked are resentful when others prosper, And predictably, they fall victim to their sinful ways, and their shame is inevitably displayed for all to see. And then Psalm 109 ends, verses 21 through 31, with a prayer of hope and praise and thanksgiving. And David turns his focus from the wickedness of his enemies and the injustices he had suffered. And David appealed to the Lord to make him, David, the object of his mercies. Praying with a broken heart, David pled for compassion and confessed his unworthiness in verse 22, saying, I am poor and needy, and my heart is wounded within me. The king's sorrows made him appreciate the brevity of life, and that it was like the passing of a shadow, verse 23. And although he was king, he had become the object of scorn. And like those who mocked Christ when he was dying on the cross, David's enemies reproached him and they shook their heads. Now I want to give you some closing thoughts to Psalm 109. David called on the Lord to be merciful, and that his mercies might be a testimony to his enemies, verse 26 and 27. And then David reasoned with the Lord that he cannot accept the curses of his enemies as long, or he could accept the curses of his enemies as long as he knew the Lord would bless him. And the psalm closes with David resolving, though his enemies assailed him, he was confident the Lord would stand at his right hand and save him from all who condemned him. I hope you enjoy this reading of Psalm 109. It's an incredibly prophetic psalm, but it's also insightful. It helps you and me know also that when we go through times of trial and trouble and we face enemies that would desire to hurt us and even destroy us, that a man after God's own heart like David suffered the same. But instead of becoming bitter, he prayed. And he put his faith in the Lord. Do the same today, I pray. God bless, and bye-bye.